It's my very great pleasure now to recognize a leading scholar who thinks deeply about the ways that culture and context work together, particularly the context of New York in the 1950s and the cultural setting that we're about in. Please, the details of his biography are in your program. His name is Juan Flores, and I would like to invite Juan to come forward and to make some remarks about where we're going.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you very much for the kind words. This is okay? I mean, can everybody see me, or should I get up here? Go up there? Okay. Oh, I feel like I'm towering over everybody. But yeah, I have some little papers here that I'm going to have to draw from. But thank you, Margaret. Thanks, everybody, for coming. And I'm here just to sort of open up. I'm the lead-off batter, in a way. And I probably am the one who has the least to do with the actual making and production and the world of West Side Story. But my job, what I've been asked to do, is to put a little bit of context into the West Side Story, the historical background, the neighborhood that's depicted there, and most of all, the people, that is the community that's depicted in West Side Story. And by that I mean, of course, the Puerto Rican community. That's my field, that's what I am. I don't know if there's any other Puerto Ricans in the house today, but that's what I'm here to try to tell you about. Like, why is it that the Puerto Ricans were the ones that inspired West Side Story? And in fact, the Puerto Ricans did inspire West Side Story. Let's not fool anybody about it. I have a great quote from none other than Leonard Bernstein here, telling how it happened. In about 1955, this is what he said. I was at a Beverly Hills pool, a swimming pool, with Arthur Lorenz. I think I was in California scoring on the waterfront. And we were talking ruefully about what a shame it was that the original East Side Story didn't work out. That was a play from '49, which was about the conflict between Jews and Catholics, actually. That was the original concept that was then abandoned by them. Then, lying next to us on somebody's abandoned chair was a newspaper headline, "Gang Fights." We stared at it, and then at each other, and realized that this, in New York, was it. The Puerto Rican thing had just begun to explode, and we called Jerry Robbins, and that's the way West Side Story, as opposed to East Side Story, was born. What the newspaper article was about was actually not about New York and Puerto Ricans. It was about Chicanos, about Mexican Americans in California, where there had been a history of gang riots and so forth, conflict between the police and the Latino community. It wasn't called Latino back then, but it was a Mexican-American community. And you might know historically that in the 40s, there were the famous zoot suit riots, where guys wore zoot suits, and the police came in, and it was a conflict with the servicemen off the boats. This was during the Second World War. And the Sleepy Lagoon case sounds pretty scary. It sounds almost as bad as Hell's Kitchen, right? The Sleepy Lagoon case. So these things are all shrouded in this kind of mystery and a sense of threatening, ominous kind of violence. And that's the thing that then inspired. The Puerto Rican thing, though, is what inspired them, because it was going to be set in New York. And the Puerto Ricans were like, you know, the latest thing, the latest thing off the boat. You know, so okay, there they are. They're involved in gang fights and so forth. And at the time, this flair, which is what the makers of or the original conceivers of the play and the musical thought about, was the flair was actually the Puerto Rican thing. That's what made it distinctive. That's what made it something different from everything else. And at the time, there was in the air the concept of the Puerto Rican problem. The Puerto Ricans had become a problem for United States society. I'll remind you of W.E.B. Du Bois, the great African-American intellectual, who said at the very beginning of his major work, The Souls of Black Folk, 1903, he said, "What does it feel like to be a problem?" And I think that from the Puerto Rican point of view, in relationship to this whole enterprise, that's the question we ask ourselves. What does it feel like to be a problem? How did it feel at that time to be branded a problem by the society as a whole? I'll mention one other quote from the very beginning by Stephen Sondheim, who said, I can't do this. I've never been that poor, and I've never even known a Puerto Rican. So there's a lack of familiarity, perhaps, a need to know a little bit more about who are these Puerto Ricans and what is the history of that. The myth, of course, is that Puerto Ricans are, as I just mentioned, recent arrivals. They just got here. They're right off the boat. There's the latest immigrants in a long line of immigrants. You know, so they're the ones that follow in the wake of the Irish and the Italians and the Jews and so forth. And now you have the Puerto Ricans, the latest ones. And there was a book at the time, Oscar Handlin, called The Newcomers. And The Newcomers, he had written, his classic work was called The Uprooted, the classic history of immigration into the United States. Well, then the book that followed was called The Newcomers, and that was about African Americans and Puerto Ricans, who were the latest groups to land into New York City and to give a different kind of a complexion, literally, to the city than it had had before. But the reality of the situation is that Puerto Ricans were not newcomers, that their presence in New York and in the United States went way back. In fact, all the way over a century before West Side Story was conceived, there were already Puerto Ricans in New York City. And they had come as a result of the new trade relations that were becoming established between the United States and the countries that had been under Spanish colonial rule. As Spain began to lose its grip, the United States began to strike up, and of course people were seeking connections to the United States economy, so that the first Puerto Ricans and other Latin Americans to arrive and settle in New York City were tradespeople and in a commercial capacity. But then after the latter part of the 19th century, it was a different kind of community that began to form. And it was made up primarily of exiles from Puerto Rico and Cuba, who were still fighting Spanish colonialism. Remember, the other countries had freed themselves in the early part of the 19th century from Spain. They had had independence wars, and they became separate republics. But Cuba and Puerto Rico were still wallowing under the old Spanish colonial rule, and their governments were very repressive toward anybody who wanted to break away from Spain at that point. Spain was clinging to its last holdings in the Americas. And so the people had to, in order to avoid persecution, had to split. And they either went to Madrid or Paris, or more and more, they went to New York City. And New York City became the hub and the base of operations for those people trying to topple the final hold of Spain on the colonies, which were Cuba and Puerto Rico. In addition to those people, there were also artisans, particularly typesetters and especially cigar rollers. The cigar industry set up shop in Florida and in New York at that time, and most of the workers were Cubans and Puerto Ricans. And so a lot of them came in, and between the exiles and the cigar rollers, they formed a very kind of radical community against colonialism, Spanish colonialism at the time. Some of them were the major heroes. The George Washingtons and the Thomas Jeffersons of Cuba and Puerto Rico lived in New York City in the 1880s and 1890s. By that I mean Jose Marti, Eugenio Maria de Hostos, if you know anything about that kind of a background. So that was the earlier, way back when. So way before West Side Story, there were Puerto Ricans, a lot of them in New York City. And then they increased over the decades, particularly after, then came, of course, the Spanish-American War, 1898, where Cuba and Puerto Rico broke loose from Spain, only to fall under the very strong sway of United States presence. And Puerto Rico became what it is today, a territory of the United States, or many people call it a colony of the United States. People don't like that word, but in fact, when you have to serve in the armed forces and don't have a right to vote for the president, the commander-in-chief, you're a colony. I mean, there's no better word for it, I'm sorry to say. Oh, wow, I didn't expect applause, but anyway, I'm here. I'm not here to be a party pooper, believe me. I love West Side Story, but I think this background is really important for us to know, to know what was going on at the time. All right, so then after the Spanish-American War, the next important step was that in 1917, during the Second World War, Puerto Ricans were made citizens of the United States. Made citizens. They weren't asked, they didn't vote. You are now citizens of the United States. So that means that, and then they started coming in droves because they didn't have to get green cards, they didn't have to go through immigration. They're just citizens already, so they just come over and they settle in the United States. They were an easy source of cheap labor, in a sense, and also cannon fodder for the war. There was First World War, and then they worked in a lot of the munitions plants as the other people were already over in the front. So that was the situation, and increasing numbers came over. And the important thing to realize, I think, throughout, all the way through, including at the period of West Side Story, is that Puerto Ricans were a different kind of immigrant than the ones who would come before. In the sense, first of all, that they were citizens of the United States already before they even came. While they were still in their home country, they were already citizens. So they were kind of foreigners, but not foreigners. They were kind of domestic foreigners. And that put them into a very different kind of a place. They were closer in some ways to internal minorities, like African Americans, than they were to the Jews and Irish and Italians who preceded them along the immigration queue. So that was a big, important change that took place. And then in the 1940s, you had the industrialization of Puerto Rico. The agricultural system fell apart. There were strikes everywhere, a lot of complaints. So they decided to industrialize the island. And in doing so, they could employ a lot of people in the new small factories that were set up. However, what it meant basically was that they were going to have an excess, a huge excess of labor, because you don't need as many people to work in the factories, small factories, as you do in the fields. So what are you going to do with all these people? Ship them out. So that's when you had the huge migration, starting in the later 40s, and especially during the 1950s, okay, West Side Story time, the 1950s, avalanches of Puerto Ricans were coming off the boats and in the airplanes. It was the first airborne migration in the history of humanity. There were people coming in these cheap old army planes that were falling apart. These stories are still told. The people are still alive that did this back in that period of time, and we talked to them, and we learned a lot about what that was like, how they came by plane. And these were people, remember, that were overwhelmingly, 95% of them were very, very poor. They were the lowest level of the society in the terms of poverty and in terms of education and in terms of labor skills. They didn't really have they weren't really ready for the kind of society that New York City was at that time. But they were promised jobs. There was still an industrial capacity in New York, which has since gone the way of the outsourcing movement. Okay, and at the time they were promised jobs. What happened was they got there, and as time went on, it became clear there really weren't the numbers and kinds of jobs that they were promised. And so therefore they found themselves in rather desperate straits. And well, what are we going to do here? Unemployment, welfare, all those things that Puerto Ricans are marked for came about because of these structural changes. But however, how were they treated? How was that interpreted? It's their fault. Their culture is deficient. They're not up to snuff. They don't know what they're doing. They have what they called a culture of poverty. You know, they just wallow in poverty. They don't know how to get out of poverty. So these were the kinds of stigmas that were attached to Puerto Rican life back in the 1950s and 60s. Books started coming out, important, prestigious books by major scholars about the Puerto Rican problem. That was the word of the day when West Side Story was made. It was the Puerto Rican problem. So the flair of West Side Story was the sociological problem of the United States society. That's the contradiction. That's the interesting connection that I think we really ought to have in mind as we go about talking about these things. And in the process, the Puerto Rican community, which, as I say, extended way back to the beginning of the 20th century and before, was transformed dramatically from what had been very much like an immigrant enclave, like the Italians, like the Jews, like the Irish, was transformed from that kind of community into what then became basically a minority ghetto. And the Puerto Ricans became, as I mentioned, more and more assimilated to African-American presence than they did toward the European immigrant presence that had preceded them. So these books, like Oscar Lewis's La Vida, by well-intentioned, liberal-minded people, mind you, not racist by any intention, but the result of a reflection of that society, the representation of that society, was one that sort of blamed the victim. It's their own fault because they live that way. And that was the outcome of it, and that's the way that they were treated. And those pathologies by Nathan Glazer and Moynihan, by Oscar Lewis, La Vida, it was called, the life and the culture of poverty, was about a Puerto Rican family that migrated, and it turned out that they were overwhelmingly prostitutes and pimps. And so how does that look as a reflection of a community when the people that you take as your sample live in that way? The implication being, well, Puerto Ricans just live that way. So, you know, that was the problem. The problem of representation is a really important one. Now, I'll get back to the 50s, which is the time we're talking about, but I want to just mention what has happened since then, that things have changed somewhat since the 50s and 60s period. In around 70 and the years before and after that, there was a new generation of Puerto Ricans came up who were born and raised in New York. They no longer had any direct ties to the island. They spoke English as a first language, and they came to be called New Yorkers. New York Ricans, all right? The New York generation emerged with their own sense of identity. Yes, we're Puerto Rican, but we're from here. We're not from there. And so it became a different kind of a situation where they began to create an art and a cultural expression that was uniquely their own. That was not from the island, and yet it wasn't typically American in any sense of the word. So is this New Yorican culture that is exemplified, perhaps you know, about salsa. Salsa music is New Yorican culture. That's New Yorican music. It was created in New York, origins in Cuban and Puerto Rican music, but mixed with jazz and rock and roll and soul music and all that other stuff. Okay? They also created a poetry, New Yorican poetry, which was a lively bilingual poetry movement in Spanish and English and mixing the languages and all that. There was an arts movement. There was a theater movement among now the New Yorican themselves. creating it at the time. This was in the decade following the West Side Story period. But then what was happening was becoming clear that the experiment of bringing all these working class people in and getting them jobs in New York wasn't working out. So by the 70s, there was already a significant return migration. People were saying, I got to get out of here. I'm not going anywhere in this society. So they started flowing back into Puerto Rico with the same lack of skills and lack of work education and the same poverty, arriving back on the island and regenerating a sense of crisis on the island. And at the same time, you had a fanning out of the population. New York had always been the hub. Now they were moving out to Philly, out to Jersey, up into Connecticut, Chicago. Other sites became homes of Puerto Ricans, all right? So that's what happened then. And then as of the later 70s, we start getting into the period closer to our own, which is that while the Puerto Ricans had been 80% of the Latino population in New York in 1970, they became less than half because of the influx. Not only because they left, but because the influx of other groups. The Dominican population swelled, the Colombian, over 100,000 Colombians, 100,000 Ecuadorians, over 200,000 Mexicans now live in New York City. So the Puerto Rican population relative to them has dwindled, has shrunk, or else in fact the numbers have basically stayed the same. It's just that the other populations have grown. So you have this Latinization of New York and the prominence of Latino things in the society now, and even Puerto Ricans for the first time, like Ricky Martin and Mark Anthony and Jennifer Lopez. You've heard of them. Well, they're all Puerto Ricans. They're not only Latinos, they're also Puerto Ricans. And they're the first ones to gain that degree of celebrity in the history of this story that I've laid out to you. Now, the second thing that I want to then talk about, and Margaret, I'm going to count on you to sort of like put up a timeout sign, or no, just to tell me if I'm running over, because I run at the mouth, and this stuff is very close to my heart, you know. And I teach it in my classes all the time, so I'm very familiar with this kind of stuff. But anyway, a little bit about the representation of Puerto Ricans. How are they projected and received in the United States public, in the society? What do people think about them? How are they presented? Well, basically, what we have is a story of invisibility, for the most part, all the way through until West Side Story was the first time you had Puerto Ricans on a Broadway stage. Before that, there was nothing, zero. And the same is true of Hollywood movies. The same even is true in the music, where you think, oh, Puerto Rican music, you know, Latin music and all that. Well, that was mainly Cuban music, actually. Although the major exponents, more and more as time went on, and on into the 60s, were mainly Puerto Ricans, but playing Cuban music. They even had groups called Machito and his Afro-Cubans, 15 musicians, 9 of them were Puerto Ricans, but they were called Afro-Cubans, because Cuba sold. Cuban stuff sold. Puerto Rican stuff did not sell. You couldn't sell Puerto Rican stuff. It wouldn't sell nowhere. So that was one thing, the invisibility, the lack of that. Desi Arnaz was not Puerto Rican, all right? He was Cuban from a very, very wealthy. His father was the mayor of Santiago de Cuba. You know, this is where Desi Arnaz came from. And also, one cannot not mention the complexion, the fact that the Puerto Rican was immigrants of color. There were black people and so forth, therefore subject to racial discrimination in ways that the earlier immigrant groups were much less so. They were, but they were much less so, much less subject to that. And so this relation to the Puerto Rican was a very complicated one on the part of the American people. There was a kind of a love-hate relationship there, because while they were represented as prone toward violence, crime, they were oversexed, they were irresponsible, they were a threat somehow because of their mongrel status to white America. And at the same time, there was a kind of a fascination with the exotic, erotic things that they represented to the American culture. And there was a kind of thrill and sensationalism about the relationship to the Latino population, as there is still today to some extent. But it's got a long history. And I think that this 50s period, it all gelled in that period when you had this throngs of people coming into New York City and changing the very demographic composition, you know, of the city. And at the same time, as West Side Story was, and these pathologies, we can call them, Oscar Lewis's work, Laser Moynihan, these pathologies and blame the victim sociology, all the talk in those days was about juvenile delinquency. Those of you who are about my age remember, because I was a juvenile delinquent. In fact, maybe in some ways I still am, okay? But I mean, I'm JD all the way, so I remember that. Everything in the paper was about juvenile delinquents. I'm not a juvenile delinquent. Remember Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers? All right, that's what was in the news. That was in the news. So when they saw gang fights, when Leonard Bernstein sees gang fights in the headline of the paper, that was not unusual. That was like every other day was gang fights, you know, and juvenile delinquents, and the big threat. There was a sense of, while there was complacency after the war and the society economy was sort of booming, and we're all given this picture of like happy-go-lucky times in American history, in fact, there was an underside to it, and it was the threat, the kind of threat of the youth. The youth culture were breaking loose, you know, and then you have the arrival of all these newcomers in here that are like changing the way things look. And you know, so it was a very special time, the time of West Side Story. And while Puerto Ricans were blamed for a lot of the juvenile delinquency, in fact, statistical analysis shows that there was no more juvenile delinquency among Puerto Ricans than anybody else. They said that was the good scapegoat at the time to say, oh look, it's these Puerto Ricans come in and they're making juvenile delinquency happen. You know, and that was one of the things that was taking place at the time. And so in 1999. As far as the representation goes, there was another very important for West Side Story history production of a thing called the Cape Man. I don't know if you've heard about the Cape Man. Hopefully you have. Can I have a show of hands? How many people ever heard of the Cape Man? Okay. Probably mainly because of Paul Simon's 1999 or 98, 99 production, which didn't really go anywhere. It was not a West Side Story, obviously. It was very badly received. It didn't really go anywhere. But it was a direct allusion to the same period of West Side Story, because the Cape Man was Salvador Agron, a 16-year-old Puerto Rican from the island, 16 years old, who was then charged with committing these murders of these two white guys in the park. Seemed to be somewhat mistaken identity, although the guy was obviously angry at the world. And then he was put up in, you know, death sentence, and then he was commuted by Eleanor Roosevelt and Nelson Rockefeller. It's a long story, and he converted in prison. While in prison, he then became, he got his education, became a poet, became a jailhouse lawyer. It's a really great story, life story of the Cape Man, Salvador Agron. Well, Salvador Agron, the episode that was the basis for the Cape Man, took place a few blocks away from where West Side Story was being produced, right in the same years. That's the West Side. I mean, it haunts. Cape Man haunts West Side Story. Looking back historically, it haunts it, and it's something that you can't now talk about West Side Story without talking about Cape Man, I think. But I'm not going to talk a lot about Cape Man. I will, however, say that no, not right now. You can call me Cape Man if you want, but I don't have my cape. I don't have my cape with me today. But I want to mention though that aside from the representations in U.S. Media and entertainment, there was also a Puerto Rican version of what that life was like by Puerto Rican writers that will not be known to you because it's all in Spanish. But there was there were many stories and plays, La Carreta, some of you might have heard of. It was also on stage in New York City back in the 50s and so forth, also representing that community, which was very important to Puerto Ricans on the island as well. Looking at that community, a different kind of a representation, though, a representation of victimized people, and a representation of people who, in spite of their poverty and lack of means, had a certain kind of dignity to them. And that's how it comes out in the Puerto Rican story. So it's interesting to juxtapose the way that it happens in U.S. Literature and representation and the way that it happens among Puerto Ricans themselves. So there's clearly another side to the story. And then in the 60s, after the West Side Story, then you have the emergence of this New Yorican literature. That is literature written by the West Side Story people, by the literature written by the Sharks themselves, all right? Written about their own life. And one very famous book was called Down These Mean Streets by Peary Thomas. It was kind of a ghetto novel. And it was really interesting. I mean, I recommend you who are interested in the world of West Side Story to read Down These Mean Streets. It's really got a different kind of portrayal of that community. Okay, I have a hand up for about to close up now. I have 5 more minutes here, so my thing is almost over. I'll be around so we can discuss things. I want to just say a little bit about Hell's Kitchen. Hell's Kitchen is the neighborhood, or the hood, as they say today, where a West Side Story was set. In its conception. It's on the west side of Manhattan. I don't know how many of you know Manhattan, but it's in the Midtown area of Manhattan. It's now called Clinton. They changed the name because it's changed in character, or it's often called Midtown West. It's the area north of 34th Street, or actually north of 42nd, and west of 8th Avenue over to the river, and down from 59th Street, down in that area, right adjacent to, alongside of Broadway and Times Square. I mean, it's right next to that, and almost has historically served that theater-going and tourist attraction community, the service people there. But mostly over the decades, and since it was first called Hell's Kitchen in 1881, all those decades, it was a place that housed a lot of stevedores for the river, the river traffic, the rail traffic that came down along the west side, so that you had a lot of very poor working class people, people living in very close, notoriously close quarters, the railroad yards, the factories, the slaughter. It was famous for slaughterhouses and lumber yards. The immigrants that populated that area were first mainly Irish and also Italian and Polish. There were riots throughout the history, going way back to the 19th century, big riots between Catholics and Protestants, between Irish and African Americans, when then they moved up into Harlem, the African Americans, and then it became the setting of what they called the concrete jungle. It was the stereotypical scary neighborhood, bad neighborhood. Hell's Kitchen, that's why the name, right? The name is so fitting, Hell's Kitchen. It's hotter than hell in that place. You don't want to go there. Don't go to that place. Don't go near there. The way the South Bronx is now, you know, I mean, so it just changes venue. But that's kind of where it was. But then the place has changed. The Puerto Ricans moved in the 50s. With the avalanche, a lot of them moved in there. Although, note, Hell's Kitchen was not the main neighborhood for Puerto Rican presence. It was a place called El Barrio, East Harlem. It was actually East Side. If they in fact wanted to set the thing where the main settlement of Puerto Ricans were, it would really be East Side Story again. Either the Lower East Side or the Upper East Side, north of the fancy East Side, in El Barrio, what's called El Barrio. Historically, that was the hub of Puerto Rican life in New York City. So things did get shunted over into the West Side because of the needs of the play itself or what have you, and because it was the one that was mainly in the news at that time. What is now Lincoln Center was once called San Juan Hill. San Juan Hill because of the Puerto Ricans living there. But that got raised, and Lincoln Center got put in its place. The Lincoln Tunnel got constructed and also changed the history of that neighborhood, which by now, and since the 70s, I would say, has really changed significantly. Those of you who go there now, you no longer really have to be afraid of anything. It's been thoroughly gentrified. It's now all been cleaned up, and all those people have been cleaned out. And you know, now you can just go there, and the restaurants and food festivals and all kinds of wonderful touristic things. I want to just end. I had other stuff, but I'm going to just end now because I had more stuff on the Cape Man, and we can talk, anybody interested in that. But I just want to end with, on the reception of West Side Story, as you know, it's been very mixed, and while some Puerto Ricans like it, and we're thrilled at the idea of having Puerto Ricans represented on the great stage by these wonderful artists that we're going to hear all about today. Others took offense at the way that the Puerto Rican community was represented in West Side Story. In spite of the intentions of the creators, nobody ever accused the creators of being racist or being anti-Puerto Rican. It's just the way you do things. I mean, it's just the way things work, and maybe we'll hear more about that from the wonderful speakers that come ahead. But I want to end with a little quote well, actually I had two little quotes from Chita Rivera. I really want to say this, that she talked about how there was a bulletin board where they were rehearsing. Maybe some of you even recall this. There was a bulletin board where they were rehearsing where they took a picture. Somebody took a picture of the Cape Man when it was a front page with the pictures of this Puerto Rican guy with a big blade and with his foot on somebody's body or something like that. It was obviously the Cape Man, and it said on it, note, this is for everybody coming in. This is your life. I guess they were trying to make it real by saying this is the way the people live that West Side Story is about. And Chita Rivera said, I saw this and it really, really affected me very deeply as a Puerto Rican because I don't live this way. My life has never been this way. I don't know anything about gangs and all this violence and all this stuff. So I felt very offended by that. And then she says, and this is what I want to end with, Chita Rivera said, it's worrisome that most of the shows with Latin themes are about crime because there's a whole other life going on that isn't reflected. Maybe the violence is what people buy and what they want to believe, but it's time something was done to show the other side of our lives. Thank you.